My point is that it either is the permanent solution or it's not. It's a binary. The Federal Reserve was never going to be able to permanently take the money back out of the system. They were always going to have to print more money. Functionally, when a currency collapses, it collapses gradually and then suddenly. The final price explosion of Bitcoin will be hyperinflation of all fiat. There is approximately 104 trillion of dollar-denominated debt that exists in the world, and there's about 6.7 trillion actual dollars. In that world, Bitcoin will become the stable thing. So long as Bitcoin's able to enforce its fixed supply, it is not a long-term risk. It becomes the least uncertain thing in the market. Once we reach some critical mass of 3% to 5% of the world, we're never going back to fiat.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Parker Lewis is the author of the seminal book, Gradually Then Suddenly. Parker is also the head of business development at Zaprite, where he's working on Bitcoin payments. Parker Lewis, welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix. How are you?
Cedric, good to be here. As I was just mentioning to you, I'm sorry it's taken this long, but I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, me too. You know, your works are seminal, and they've been part of my journey. But also, I got to see you live at BitBlock Boom, probably more than once, but once in particular. I don't know if you remember your Mike Tyson knockout, punch out.
Yeah. Body blows, not knockout punches.
Yeah, so I hope we get to that in a little bit. But first, I'd love to hear your rabbit hole story, how you came to Bitcoin, how Bitcoin maybe found you, or what happened there.
Sure. Bitcoin found me in 2016. 2016. I was working for a hedge fund in Dallas, Texas, and I was on one hand doing research as to what would happen when the Federal Reserve began to unwind post-Great Financial Crisis quantitative easing, the $3.6 trillion that it introduced into the financial system from 2009 to 2014. In the 2016 timeframe, it had signaled plans in the near future that it would begin to take that money out of the system. And I was doing research and trying to develop my own view of what would happen to a broad range of financial markets. At the same time that I was going down that rabbit hole, and ultimately when I did that, I came to the conclusion that the Federal Reserve was never going to be able to permanently take the money back out of the system, that they were always going to have to print more money, and that it was a function of leverage, the amount of dollar debt that existed in the world relative to the actual number of dollars that could service that debt, and that the only way that quantitative easing or the introduction of money is designed to work is to actually expand the credit system, so it always functionally needs more money to support it. At the same time that I was going down that research path, I was asked to go do diligence on a gold company that serendipitously led a good friend of mine to introduce me to Safety and a Moose. It was before Safety had written the Bitcoin standard, but formed a friendship with Safe. Safe helped me understand why gold was money. As part of the diligence process, and it was around the same time that he was becoming interested in Bitcoin. And as I'd like to think that I went from zero to gold to Bitcoin very quickly, but it took me a little while to get to gold first. But as soon as gold started to click, then I started to understand why Bitcoin existed, why it had fundamental value, that it was solving the same problem but in a perfected form, and that my two paths of research really converged. It was like, okay, they're always going to have to print dollars. And now I have some anchoring as to why Bitcoin was created, to solve that problem, not just the printing of dollars, but the printing of euros and yen and fiat money all over the world. So that was mid 2016, mid to late 2016. So yeah, then everything fit into place and continue to go deeper down the rabbit hole.
Sure. When you mentioned like gold is money, what kind of do you remember maybe your own reaction to this journey of like almost like maybe I'm a fish in water. I've never really thought about what money is, what that question is, and here I am. I think gold is money now. Do you remember sort of that journey and that epiphany?
Sure. Yeah. I remember thinking before figuring out why gold was money that I had this express thought that, gold is a shiny rock. It's a relic. If I ever needed gold, I'd rather have guns and ammo and cattle, and, like be out on a ranch sovereign. But I hadn't really ever questioned that root principle of what money is, and I think that is the principal question that someone has to be interested in to want to go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, but also to be interested in order to understand Bitcoin. And so, I have an economics degree from college, but one of the things I also recognized was that economics as a field of study, it assumes money exists and then it builds assumptions on top of it, but it never questions the foundation. And it's one of the reasons why I think Bitcoin is so hard to understand. And so, that is one aspect of Bitcoin that requires humility, and it's perfectly natural because it's just very few people, not like certain people have, but it's not everyone, but very few people have, questioned, why the dollar has value in the first place, whether it's a collective hallucination. And if you just accept that reality that no one has had to evaluate actual money, like one money versus another, what makes something money, that it's easier to have humility and to be like, okay, yeah, let's go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, I remember taking economics 350 in college, and it's money and banking. You talk a lot about money supply, M2, M3, but really nothing about what is money or...
Right. Yeah, like my courses that I would take, whether it was corporate finance or economics course, they would talk about a central bank and active management of the money supply. So it's not that they wouldn't talk about money, but they wouldn't question why the dollar was money or how something emerges on the market as money. And I do think that will be something that, going forward, obviously people are currently going down that journey themselves as they become interested in Bitcoin. I think on the other side of the horizon, when it's very clear that Bitcoin is the new money and it's the money that everyone is using day to day, that it will be a core part of the education. People will realize that the curriculum missed. If they're going to teach economics, well, we have to teach what makes a form of money better or worse, and what has, the history of money, which a lot of Safedean's The Bitcoin Standard helped elucidate for me and for, millions of other people who have either read the book or listened to the audio or read snippets online or listened to his podcast.
What inspired you to write Gradually Then Suddenly?
Well, what inspired me to write? Well, the non kind of intellectual answer was that I was working for Unchained at the time, and which is a Bitcoin custody and financial services platform that helps people self-custody. But I needed a way to, reach an audience, and writing felt like a good way to do that. But the more fundamental side of it was I had gone, after, I'd say, discussions with Safe about gold and, kind of getting into the Austrian economic rabbit hole. And even after Bitcoin clicked for me, after reading an early draft of the Bitcoin Standard before it came out and reading Mastering Bitcoin by Andreas Antonopoulos and figuring out how Bitcoin as a network actually works, kind of the glue, there were still logical questions that almost I had figured out as conclusions through a number of different data points, but I had to consistently question the logic to test the assumption, because a lot of times people look at Bitcoiners and they think that we're crazy. The reality is that no one wants to store their value in something that will lose purchasing power over time. And if you've gotten to the position of Bitcoin being money and you have a hardened view as to why that is, most people to be highly convicted in that view have had to challenge their own thinking. I have every incentive to if I'm wrong, I want to know it. And so even after the idea of Bitcoin had clicked for me, there were logical questions that I had to test about, Bitcoin being too volatile, or, why can't somebody just outcompete it? Why doesn't something else come along with a better feature set? what about the transaction throughput? And so I had already worked those through in my head, but I was like, well, I think that other people would benefit from seeing or reading a very logically ordered explanation for what are the most common and natural questions about Bitcoin. And so I thought that that would be additive to the body of work that might accelerate a certain audience down the path of the Bitcoin rabbit hole and kind of walk them, leading the horse to water of like, hey, these are all logical things that even once Bitcoin starts to click, there are these residual questions that the faster or in a more accelerated basis that you can get to them as a real strong kind of bottoms up view, then you won't be relying on anybody's opinion. And so I thought it was complementary to what else was out there. And it was what I personally had to think through and reason through even after Bitcoin kind of in its more holistic view started to click for me.
Wow. What were you trying to get across with the title, Gradually Then Suddenly?
Well, the funny thing was there was another title that I was originally thinking about, and I was like right on the fringe. It was something called like the Intolerant Minority. But I gave a presentation and one of the presentations at BitBlock Boom where the saying "gradually then suddenly" is a common adaptation of how Hemingway described the process of going bankrupt in The Sun Also Rises. And so it was one character talking to another, and one character asked the other, how did you go bankrupt? And the other character said 2 ways, first gradually and then suddenly. And the way I saw that translate to Bitcoin is that like functionally when a currency collapses, it collapses gradually and then suddenly. And like when a currency collapses, it's functionally like either the country or the government being insolvent in the fiat world. And so if it applies to how an individual goes bankrupt, it's how a country basically becomes insolvent, or at least its government, because it happens over a period of time. And then at some sudden moment, you actually realize that you're insolvent. It's also how people come to understand Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is the other side of the same coin of the fiat currency collapse. And so it's starting to make sense. It's starting to make sense. It's starting to make sense slowly, and then some idea will happen, or you'll have some life experience that connects a bunch of dots all at once. And at that point, I would describe it as like when you see Bitcoin for the first time, or when the picture starts to become into focus. It's still not crystal clear, but everything is kind of at one moment come together in a way where you can not just see that Bitcoin is possible probabilistically, but that you could start to order things and explain to yourself why. And so for a lot of reasons, the similarity between, the original, it's not even a framework, the original dialogue in his book that Hemingway described, that it was the way that people go bankrupt is the way that currencies hyperinflate, and how people come to understand Bitcoin.
Yeah. Which is interesting because, I mean, the Gradually Then Suddenly has become kind of a meme on its own.
Yeah,
one of my favorite.
I would say it was a meme before, but I'd say the book and the series popularized it in the Bitcoin world.
Yeah, and I think there's different interpretations maybe of the meme. I think a lot of people, or I shouldn't speak for other people, I think of it a lot now as sort of like the notion of price explosion, gradually then suddenly.
Well, right,
way to describe it.
When you can think about price explosion of Bitcoin, or like the final price explosion of Bitcoin will be the hyperinflation of all fiat. And so the other side of Bitcoin's price explosion is, it's like I like to say that fiat is not collapsing because of Bitcoin. Fiat is collapsing because you can print money out of thin air. But Bitcoin's the solution to it. And so I think that, certainly, everyone has room to interpret for themselves. It's like, in my view, there's an individual side of it where it's like when Bitcoin clicks for you. But then there's also, like, you can see on a chart when a fiat currency hyperinflates. Like, you can see when the Venezuelan bolivar hyperinflated. You can see when the Argentine peso hyperinflated relative to the US dollar. Like, you can look at a chart, and if you're looking at the chart, all of the fundamentals that went into that currency collapse were, those bones were buried, or the bodies were buried in the years or decades before but in a moment you can see when it breaks and it never comes back. And I would think of like these more interim moves as like these interim moves of Bitcoin going from 10,000 to 20,000 to 30,000 to 100,000. There are still very few number of people in the world who really understand what's happening. Once we reach some critical mass of 3% to 5% of the world, we're never going back to fiat. And so in my own view, I think of the suddenly moment as when like the world figures it out and Bitcoin rapidly monetizes. But I also think about it on an individual level of like when Bitcoin clicks for people. Like that is a sudden moment, and it happens to each person on their own timeline. So
when it comes to Bitcoin, the rules are simple. Run your own node, hold your own keys, and protect your seed phrase. That's where MicroSeed comes in. Unlike bulky backups, MicroSeed is stamped onto a tiny steel washer. Fireproof, waterproof, and so small you can carry it anywhere or hide it in plain sight. Go to microseed.io and use the code MATRIX for a discount on your order.
Yeah, I mean, I really like both. I think being grounded in sort of the individual one, or is more grounding. But or for me personally right now. But why is Bitcoin's fixed supply so important?
Bitcoin's fixed supply is so important because it substantively represents a form of money that can't be printed, and that, as history has shown, the forms of money that are hardest to produce win. And in the end, it won't be possible to produce any incremental Bitcoin at all. And that is the fundamental reason why Bitcoin stores purchasing power and why people adopt Bitcoin. The Bitcoin's fixed supply is inherently intertwined with the network's ability to be resistant to all forms of censorship and to remain permissionless. If Bitcoin were not permissionless and were not resistant to censorship, then its fixed supply would not be credibly enforced without trust. So they all go together. But the shelling point of Bitcoin is the reason why Bitcoin might be volatile, the reason why why Bitcoin stores value and why people adopt it is because more of it can't be produced. And if more of it could be produced, the evidence of that would be in its price and would be in the lack of adoption. The single greatest data point of Bitcoin being able to enforce its fixed supply is its price going up over time. In present world, that is typically compared against fiat currencies like the dollar, the euro, the yen. At a more fundamental economic level, it is purchasing power relative to real goods and services. And that's really what really matters. And that Bitcoin's fixed supply at a fundamental level, from an economic foundation perspective, or from the foundation of money, is that it will allow for the coordination of trade far more efficiently and far more effectively than money that can be printed out of thin air. And money as a tool is what helps coordinate economic activity at scale. And so, it's the shelling point that you can focus in on and say, why is this form of money better than the next form of money? Well, because every other form of money is based on trust. Bitcoin is not, and the evidence of it is that it has a fixed supply that can't be altered, or that a central bank or a government or any third party cannot manipulate. And so it's really the foundation around everything about Bitcoin's value. And then the other side of it is that, and I talk about this in the book, which is that money, for very fundamental reasons, due to the nature of the problem that it solves, converges to one common medium, or that economic systems converge on one form of money. Because in order for you and I to trade, we have to have a consensus of money. I have to have the form of money you're willing to accept, and you have to accept the form of money that I have. And that if we're all out in the market looking for what would make a good form of money, well, the money that can't be printed or the money that can't be produced easily becomes what we both look at objectively and say, hey, we'd rather have that one than any other.
Right. And you go on to explain in the piece reasons, being Bitcoin can't be faked or copied. And, the incentives are so strong to cooperate more than the opportunity cost, which is too high to defect. Why is Bitcoin's monetary policy so credible and resilient?
In short, it's because the system is designed so that nobody has to trust anybody else. And so like when you think about Bitcoin as a system, you could think about it as a system that has a form of money with a fixed supply, and that the alternative to that is something like gold or a fiat currency that can be easily printed. But another way to think about it is a trusted system like the Federal Reserve's or the Bank of Japan's or the European central banks, or a system that has removed the need for trust, which is Bitcoin. So it's trusted or trustless. And, at the core of that, it is that if you had to trust some individual not to print money, that history has shown that anybody that has the ability to print money will print money. And for a group of market participants to be able to voluntarily opt in to Bitcoin as a currency system, the only way that system could work is if no one had to trust anybody else. And that there is a kind of, again, it comes back to the Schelling point, which is, well, just if I have a system that is, that it's important that nobody have to trust anybody else, if each individual in the market were looking for what makes for a better or worse form of money, the one that has the lowest rate of change, the one that's hardest to produce, is ultimately going to win. And so people are opting in for selfish reasons. One, I can opt in voluntarily without permission to this form of money that can't be printed. And then everybody who's opting into that form of money has a selfish interest to protect the very thing that they've opted into. And what they are functionally doing in protecting it, whether it be running a node or mining Bitcoin, is ensuring that nobody else has the ability to print money. And anybody that attempted to create more than 21 million Bitcoin, that any of those Bitcoin transactions would be invalidated. And so there's this common interest that everyone in the world would benefit from a form of money that can't be printed. And anyone that participates in Bitcoin is not doing so altruistically. They're doing so in their own self-interest. But by opting in, they're effectively saying, I'm willing to opt into a system which I don't control, and I can't print the money, but I can help ensure that nobody else can as well. And that, aggregate of hundreds of thousands, millions of people acting in their own self-interest to enforce the rules of Bitcoin against everyone else is just simply saying, like, I'm going to opt into a system in which I can't print money, but I don't have an incentive to allow anybody else to. And so the 21 million sits at the top, but if somebody had to trust someone else's word, or you just had to trust software, that statement is true. That statement is what one of the Supreme Court justices, Antonin Scalia, referred to as, he would have described that as a parchment guarantee, or what the founders would have described as a parchment guarantee. Like, Bitcoin doesn't have a fixed supply because software code says so, or because you or I say so. It has a fixed supply of 21 million that's credible because it has removed trust and everyone's enforcing the rules against each other. And so everyone has that same incentive to find a form of money that works, that's hard to produce. And in Bitcoin, they can opt in and actually enforce the rules against everybody else.
Sure. So now we're talking about sort of the Federal Reserve, money printing, money creation. Is Bitcoin a hedge against inflation?
Well, I would describe it as, at a fundamental level, it's a solution to inflation, and that the important recognition is that there's a difference between a hedge to inflation and the solution to inflation. And that hedges to inflation historically have been things like gold, or really anything that has, well, gold doesn't have its income tied to dollars, but something like equities or real estate have become hedges to inflation because they're correlated to dollar inflation. As more dollars are created, the real estate earns more because there's more dollars floating around, or the companies that earn dollars have more, are making more money. But the money is broken, and the only thing that can fix a broken form of money is a better form of money. And that while something like real estate or equities clearly don't fix the problem of money, they aren't money, they are naturally viewed as hedges. You could look at something like gold, but gold sits at the epicenter of where fiat spawned from. Fiat emerged off of the back of gold and then was able to completely sever itself from the original gold-backed monetary system, which is where the dollar came from. And I look at that and say, hey, we're never going, like, gold is part of the problem. Like, if gold was viable as money, fiat wouldn't exist. That the problem of fiat exists in large part because of the limitations of gold. And then I come look at this dilemma and say, like, yes, Bitcoin is maintaining its purchasing power and it is offsetting inflation. And in one definition, you could say, hey, that's a hedge to inflation. My point is that it either is the permanent solution or it's not. It's a binary. And by being the permanent solution, it's not just offsetting the debasement of the dollar so you can get more dollars to buy the goods and services. It's actually the replacement. And if you are on that, you can't just exist in the middle of those 2 points. You either don't understand Bitcoin, and Bitcoin cannot hedge inflation because it's so volatile. Bitcoin will go down, you'll sell it. Bitcoin will go up, you'll sell it. It hasn't hedged dollar inflation in either of those scenarios. But once Bitcoin starts to make sense to you, once it clicks, and there's a function of time where your understanding needs to harden of actually owning Bitcoin, experiencing it, potentially running a full node, controlling your own keys, sending Bitcoin transactions, that as the picture comes into focus, you realize that it is not a hedge like that real estate is viewed to be a hedge or equities are viewed to be a hedge, that it is a form of money. It's a currency system that is fully functional. It's volatile because it's nascent and adoption is not yet at a mature level. But where the end game is, where it ends, is everyone adopts Bitcoin. Bitcoin's perfectly stable, and Bitcoin's the pricing mechanism. Prices are denominated in Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is used to affect day-to-day transactions for virtually the entire world. You're either at a point of zero knowledge where you haven't started to see why what I just described is the end game, and realistically, again, just Bitcoin cannot hedge inflation in that world. And if it starts to make sense, it becomes inevitable that you get to the other, bookend of the spectrum, seeing it as the ultimate solution. So functionally speaking, I don't think it can be a hedge, but it is the permanent solution.
Right. And so you see it as binary and a replacement of the dollar. Why do you consider Bitcoin relative to two guideposts like gold and the dollar financial system? Are those the only two guideposts you would look at?
I think they're the most relevant guideposts to anyone evaluating the question today. And, not necessarily with the exception, but I would say that would extend out to any fiat currency in the world. I live in a dollar economy, so the dollar emerged from gold. Gold and the dollar are the two most logical guideposts. But if you live in China and you have the yuan, or Japan and you have the yen, or if you were in the UK and the pound sterling, then the pound sterling becomes the logical guidepost, that it's some form of commodity money and your fiat money. Because the question is, hey, for practically all living people, it was a commodity money that emerged to a fiat money that got us into the problem where we're at today. And there's either a view that we're going back to the commodity metal, or we're going forward to something else. And so functionally speaking, I'd say, I could respond to why it's not like something, anything other than those two buckets of categories. But those are historically what have been money. And if Bitcoin is money, then the most logical things to compare it against from a properties perspective, like relative scarcity, the ability to transact, the ability to measure value, the ability to achieve final settlement, to actually transfer value, that those are what have existed previously. And in order for one money to replace another, it would logically need to perform the function of money better than its predecessor or predecessors. And then the logical question becomes, well, what properties are, most relevant or significant to money, and how does Bitcoin compare from a perspective of individual properties to historical goods like the dollar or gold or pound sterling or silver that were used as money, because those are the inputs that will guide what's going to happen from here. That the monetary properties are the inputs and the price is the output. Because the inputs of the properties like Bitcoin's fixed supply, like the ability to transact over a communication channel, like it being censorship resistant and permissionless, and understanding some of how the network works, that hardened understanding is what allows someone to see why Bitcoin might go in a logically ordered way from nascent and volatile to very stable in the end, because or the way I think about it is it would guide an individual decision of why one individual would adopt it, but that same decision point for any individual is the functionally same decision point for all individuals.
Health insurance is broken. I know it, you know it. So when open enrollment rolls around and all those health insurance companies start hoping you'll just re-sign, eyes closed, for the same overpriced plan with confusing fine print, it feels like they're betting on your inaction. But we deserve better than that. That's why I started looking for something different for me and my family. Something honest. That's when I found CrowdHealth. With CrowdHealth, it's not about profits. It's about people and community. You get a team that helps negotiate your bills, access to low-cost prescriptions and lab tests, and a list of doctors who don't treat you like a number. And if something major happens, you cover the first $500. Then the crowd steps in to help share the rest. It feels real. It feels like taking care of your health the way it should be. Simple, direct, and human. Thousands of members already say CrowdHealth saved them tens of thousands of dollars over traditional insurance. And with many subsidy programs ending and costs rising, there's never been a more important time to take charge of your health care. So this open enrollment, don't sign because you're told to. Sign because you choose to. If you're ready to join a community that looks out for you, give CrowdHealth a try. Join CrowdHealth to get started today for $99 for your first 3 months using code MATRIX at joincrowdhealth.com. CrowdHealth is not insurance. Opt out. Take your power back. This is how we win. All right. I want to cover what is the difference between risk and volatility? Why are they so often conflated?
Risk and volatility. To go into that at a high level. One, I'll just speak in practical terms for Bitcoin. If the price of Bitcoin is $100,000 and there's a chance that Bitcoin goes to $80,000, which it recently did, in some way based on a certain time horizon, that's a risk. Like if you needed your money over the last 30 days and you needed $100,000 to purchase something, if there were a probability that Bitcoin could go down in the short term by $20,000, that's a risk to you. But at that same time, risk is really a function of future uncertainty, and future uncertainty has a function of time as a component. So 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. The way I think about Bitcoin and why when I view it as volatile but not risky is because the basis of Bitcoin adoption is its fixed supply, and that is a finite surface area. People can look at the equation and come to different conclusions, but it is, can it enforce its fixed supply or can it not? And then does the logic and reason follow from there that if Bitcoin is able to enforce its fixed supply, then will the world adopt it as money? Because that's another question. The way that I look at it is that so long as Bitcoin's able to enforce its fixed supply, it is not a long-term risk. It becomes the least uncertain thing in the market. And that the least uncertain thing in the market that's also able to be easily transacted, sent over the communication channel to achieve final settlement and to facilitate trade, that then you start to see its volatility not as a risk. It's only a risk, to the degree that you need something in the very short term, but it's not a risk in terms of its actual fundamental value. And so another way to think about risk and volatility is something like a bond. Like a bond might be you look at the screen and you might see that its value is trading at par, and then you might find that the company is bankrupt and its value goes to zero. It becomes volatile at some future point in time, but the reason for that violent price movement, it wasn't that it wasn't volatile, or sorry, it wasn't that it wasn't risky. It was just that the market didn't have the information to cause it to be volatile sooner. And so it's this idea that volatile things are not necessarily risky, and the reverse is also true, which is that things that appear not to be volatile are actually risky, or can be. And so, kind of the short end of it is, what is the relative amount of uncertainty? And the longer you go out in Bitcoin, the less uncertain it becomes, because the short-term volatility becomes less relevant to you.
All right, I want to kind of zoom out a little bit here. I want to throw two questions at you. Hopefully, you do an amazing job. So just another high-level walkthrough would be great. How indebted is the entire market? And like, when you how short is the world dollars?
Yeah, so I'll describe the U.S. because I don't have nearly as tight a view on the global system, but the dollar and the Fed and the U.S. financial system is the largest in the world. There is approximately 104 trillion of dollar-denominated debt that exists in the world, and there's about 6.7 trillion actual dollars. So, 17 times. Now, at the time of the Great Financial Crisis in 2009, the 104 trillion of debt, and again, that is a very vanilla way of looking at debt. It's not including things like unfunded pension liabilities or derivatives. It is just fixed liability, fixed maturity debt in terms of you owe X by Y date. It could have a variable rate, it could have a fixed rate. That number is tracked by the Fed in the Fed's Z1 report, the Financial Accounts of the United States. So it's not a number that you have to cobble together based on a bunch of random sources. That 104 trillion is a Fed number, and that number at the time of the financial crisis was 52.7 trillion. So another framework that I think about is that the problem in 2007 and 8, the Great Financial Crisis, was that we had a credit system that was unsustainable. There was too much debt and too few dollars. That 52 trillion has now doubled, and that the way that QE is designed to work, the way that the injection of money into the financial system is designed to work, is to prop up the credit system such that the too much debt can be sustained for a longer period of time. But also the way that it is designed to work is to induce more debt creation or more credit creation. And so we went from a world that was too much debt and unsustainable to a world now today that exists with twice as much debt in the world. And so that relationship between debt and dollars is, one of the principal reasons why the Federal Reserve, why any central bank constantly has to print money. It's also why the dollar has some tethering of value, because the debt is represented or has claims against real assets. It has claims against equity in businesses. It has claims against cars and houses and personal income streams. So it's tied to real things, but it's also what ensures that more and more money will be created to be able to sustain higher and higher debt levels.
Right. And I want to read from your piece. The existence of a debt or credit system that is in order of magnitude larger than the amount of money that actually exists causes a few dynamics that may not be immediately intuitive. When the Fed digitally creates money, there's still far more debt that exists, which is what prevents the dollar from immediately collapsing in value in the end. The existence of more dollars does cause each dollar to purchase less in the future and over time. But the credit system, given its size, is necessarily at the crux of how it all plays out. The debt to dollar dilemma is what anchors the dollar's value on a near-term basis. The liabilities are fixed in the sense that the fixed amount of dollars are owed. In terms of all this, would you want to see the Fed to disappear as soon as possible? Is that a positive end game in terms of is it more positive the faster it goes away?
When it comes to Bitcoin, the rules are simple. Run your own node, hold your own keys, and protect your seed phrase. That's where MicroSeed comes in. Unlike bulky backups, MicroSeed is stamped onto a tiny steel washer. Fireproof, waterproof, and so small you can carry it anywhere or hide it in plain sight. Go to microseed.io and use the code MATRIX for a discount on your order.
I don't know. I think that you could look at it from two ways. From a fundamental perspective, you're like, hey, the sooner that everyone can get on sound money, the better. Another view of it is, hey, the slower the decline, the more time that Bitcoin has to mature, the more infrastructure gets built, the less likely the pain is for when the big collapse happens. So I don't really take a view as to, if I were to take a view, I'd probably say, hey, if Bitcoin had 5 or 10 more years to develop, the amount of pain that is felt when the big collapse of the currency happens will be lessened. On the other side of it is like, hey, well, a lot more suffering has to happen between the next 5 and 10 years of people getting slowly bled out by relying on a form of money that is just not working for the vast majority of all people that are using it. The vast majority of Americans have no savings and a lot of debt, and so it's more of like a slow death rather than like a, hey, would we be better off by a lot more volatility now and a rapid shift to Bitcoin. So I don't think there's a clear answer, and I think that Bitcoin is the other side of the same coin. So it's like once enough people have figured out Bitcoin, it's probably because enough infrastructure existed to allow more people to adopt it, and it will coincide with trillions more dollars, euro, yen being digitally created, which will also help people understand Bitcoin. So I think it's going to play out however it's going to play out. And what I would say more definitively for people is that the way I think about it is surviving in all weathers. Surviving in a world where it's a more rapid shift, in the next 5 to 7 years or 20 or 30 years, that you got to be able to survive in either scenario, and that the only way through that path is through adopting Bitcoin.
Sure. And then maybe touching a little bit more on inflation. What have you seen with maybe your price per pound of brisket tracker?
Oh, price. Well, I do price per ribeye, but I also do pay attention to price of brisket. But I think it's important to track commodities at the same location, so to really know the true level of inflation. And because in your local, and I look at food because it's the thing that, we need food and water to survive. And so when I started looking at my local grocery store, which is a Whole Foods that I go to, or I used to go to every week, I started paying attention, and I noticed that the price had gone up from $19.99 to $21.99 between 2020 and 2021, a 10% increase. That same piece of beef that cost $19.99 a pound is today $34.49 a pound, and it hasn't quite doubled, but it's almost doubled over the course of 5 years. And so, whether it's the price of brisket or the price of ribeye, it's just like it's the same store, the same piece of meat. Now, there's a chance it might also be substituting in a lower quality of meat. So shrinkflation also exists in commodities based on quality. But something to the tune of 60 to 70% aggregate inflation and, 12 to 13%, annualized. But it's just also interesting to look. Like there's a local place that I go get brisket. Probably in the last year I saw the price increase from $14 a half pound to $14.49, and then I just recently realized that it went. Noticed the last time I went there that it was $14.99, because more commonly the way that inflation actually happens is, someone might see the CPI is 4% or 3% or 6%. But if you start tracking individual goods that you consume, you'll actually realize that the real rate for you of things that you consume is higher, and that the way that it gets to levels of 10% and 12% a year is typically not in a single price increase. It's typically multiple price increases throughout the course of a year, and that there is something significant about the price is changing faster. That once people are able, like an exercise, someone might say like, oh, a beer at the bar is $6. I remember when a beer at a bar used to cost $1.50, and that's some time back in time. But when you can start to pay attention, or when you start to pay attention, you're like, oh, that price increased 3 months ago, and now it's increasing another 4% today. It's like, this is actually a 16% annualized rate of increase. That as people start to realize both the degree to which goods and services are getting more expensive, but also the frequency, that is really where we get to this point of nearing the stage of hyperinflation, when the rate of change, when it's not just the rate of change, it's the frequency of change, is that people become more observant of what is actually happening.
Sure. I want to read a little bit more from your work before I get into the final topic. Bitcoin simultaneously being the ultimate solution to the dollar and it not being immune to the dollar is entirely consistent with the nature of the problem. An understanding of one and its challenges necessarily informs the other as a better alternative and how it may be adopted. Bitcoin is competing with the dollar to replace it as the form of money which coordinates trade and commerce. If one were to accept that there were fundamental problems inherent to the dollar, but that it still coordinates practically all economic activity for those that use it, it would stand to reason that any replacement to the dollar would not be immune to its issues during the transitionary period. In an academic world, maybe everyone figures it out at the same time and makes a conscious decision to scrap the old world, adopt the new world, and move on without any consequences to the sins of the past. The dilemma is that money coordinates trade, and trade means the physical manufacture and delivery of goods and services in the real world, which is far more complex than professional economists and academia might suggest. The world cannot drop a bad money and adopt a better one, like a single individual can drop a bad habit. It's just not that simple, and that's okay. Today, the dollar exists, and Bitcoin has a total purchasing power of approximately 0.4% when this was written, of the U.S. credit system, which itself is a fraction, albeit a larger one, of the global financial system. If the Fed reduces the supply of dollars and increases interest rates, the purchasing power of Bitcoin will reasonably decline on an interim basis relative to the dollar, because the entire world still relies on the dollar, including everyone in the dollar economy who has begun adopting Bitcoin. Bitcoin remains relatively small. It is also liquid, and there are very few Bitcoin-denominated debt liabilities on a relative and absolute basis, which means it can be easily sold to source dollars as the supply becomes constrained. In short, dollar inflation can exist and the purchasing power of Bitcoin can decline at the same time while the fundamental remains unchanged, that Bitcoin is replacing the dollar as a better form of money to coordinate trade. Bitcoin has fundamental value because of its fixed supply. That is the value proposition, a fixed supply of Bitcoin versus an ever-increasing supply of dollars. And I'm going to skip some of the stats here. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, and that is Bitcoin's true innovation. Whenever something happens in the world, and specifically anything that causes volatility in the price of Bitcoin, I always ask myself, did X change anything about the Bitcoin network's ability to credibly enforce its fixed supply? Now, one might need to know how Bitcoin enforces its fixed supply and its relevance in order to then evaluate the relative impact of anything to Bitcoin. But that is to the point. Without a prior understanding of how Bitcoin enforces its fixed supply or why it's important, it would leave anyone in a precarious position to evaluate any current event or its impact on Bitcoin's fundamental value. Anyone who claims that Bitcoin will fail due to the failures of a few private companies almost certainly does not understand how Bitcoin enforces its fixed supply or its consequences. Separately, anyone who claims that Bitcoin is failing on its promise as a hedge to inflation similarly could not tell you how Bitcoin enforces its fixed supply. Ask anyone who claims Bitcoin will fail or otherwise has failed that rhetorical question, but how does Bitcoin credibly enforce its fixed supply without the need for trust? The stats I skipped over around the money supply increasing from 2007 to 2024, which you covered prior in the show. So the final topic I want to get into is medium of exchange. You're at Zaprite. You're working on Bitcoin as payments. Why is the use of Bitcoin as a medium of exchange and payments important?
Sure. And I'll tie it back to this idea of why, thinking about this transition that we're going to from a dollarized world to a Bitcoinized world, and that while people realistically think about the value of a house or the value of a stock or even the value of Bitcoin in dollar-denominated terms, that functionally speaking, what the dollar is doing is coordinating trade. That supply chains of getting goods and services to the grocery store or to a Home Depot or to a Walmart is a highly complex system of individual supply chains, and dollars transferring to coordinate all the activity that allows everything that you need in your daily life to show up as you need it. And that is the core utility of money. And that if you think about any individual supply chain, even if one person has figured out Bitcoin, it's going to require a lot more people than just one in that supply chain to fully shift over. But that for Bitcoin to work, it ultimately does need to detach itself from fiat exchange. And the way that I would think about articulating that is that when we talk a lot about the importance of Bitcoin's fixed supply and the credibility of its fixed supply and the ability for the Bitcoin network to enforce its fixed supply without the need for trust, it is inherently dependent on the network being sufficiently decentralized to be immune to outside force of someone saying, or someone trying to co-opt the system to create more than 21 million, or to say that you can't use the system. And that the fiat system as it is constructed is hyper-centralized. It's built on top of a central bank and a diminishing number of banks, but realistically 5 or 6 mega banks that control everything. And that both create a very permissioned system, but also sit at the epicenter of allowing the world to exist in such a way that money can be easily created by the Fed and then distributed to everybody. That if Bitcoin only worked in a world where you had to convert to the fiat system to get dollars back out, to then be able to access the real economy, the goods and services that you need to sustain yourself day to day, the actual fundamental utility of money as a medium independent of Bitcoin and coordinating trade. If Bitcoin only existed in a world where you could hold Bitcoin and Bitcoin would store its value in theory, and then whenever you needed dollars, you could sell the Bitcoin for dollars, that Bitcoin would be so centralized in that world that the integrity of the system as a whole would not be viable. Basically, the centralization of the fiat system would extend onto Bitcoin, and then that showing point of its fixed supply would be at risk. The other side of it is that Bitcoin is technically capable of being used day to day in commerce, and that one of the ways that I contextualize its volatility is because of its nascency. If 1% of the world has adopted Bitcoin and then 10% start to adopt Bitcoin, and that means that 9 out of 10 people are pricing Bitcoin for the first time. Volatility is inevitable in that world. The incremental demand relative to the base demand is so great, and the knowledge of all those market participants is so variable with the newer 9 out of 10 literally pricing something for the first time, learning about Bitcoin, that script will flip when 50% of the world has adopted Bitcoin, and every incremental unit of demand of Bitcoin is a fraction rather than a multiple. In that world, Bitcoin will become the stable thing. You won't think of the price of a Bitcoin as 100,000 or 500,000 or $1 million, the dollar value of everything, just like the bolivar value of everything, becomes irrelevant. That things will start to be priced. The car will cost a certain amount of Bitcoin. The ribeye at the grocery store will cost a certain amount of Bitcoin. And just as we don't think if a beer costs $6, we don't think of the value of a dollar as 1/6 of a beer, even though that is one way to think about the value of a single dollar. And so the point is that if we look at the world and say, hey, the basis of why anybody would store their value in Bitcoin is because of its fixed supply. Well, the natural extension of that is if you figured out that equation, you'd say, well, I could either receive my Bitcoin by accepting fiat, paying the cost of the fiat system, and then paying the cost to convert fiat to Bitcoin, or because Bitcoin is perfectly technically capable of facilitating that trade directly, I could just accept Bitcoin. So if I'm a merchant and I sell goods and services and I've figured out why Bitcoin stores value, it's very logical for me to ask somebody if they're willing to pay me in Bitcoin. It's just it's a logical extension. But then when it comes down to its necessity, it is that if Bitcoin didn't logically progress to that world of more merchants saying, oh, well, just pay me in Bitcoin, I'd rather have the form of money that can't be printed rather than the one that is consistently losing its value, that the only logical explanation for why that alternate reality would exist would be because somebody told you that you couldn't do it, that it was illegal to do, that by some fiat decree it would say, you can't use your Bitcoin to buy things like cars or gas, or as a merchant to on the other side to accept it. And that also, that reality, the only version of that would be that in order for that to exist, because the Bitcoin system remained hyper centralized. And so it's a combination of the actual economic incentive, which is the most efficient way to transfer value will be just to accept Bitcoin directly, but then paired with the consequence if that incentive didn't actually play out, if that world didn't exist where people weren't able to functionally accept Bitcoin as payment, it would be not because of a technical limitation of Bitcoin, but because of it being made illegal and Bitcoin not being sufficiently decentralized at that point where some ban in some jurisdiction would be defensible, which I think about that as like the largest game of whack-a-mole that you could ever that you could ever conceive of. That if the U.S. government couldn't ban booze, or kind of they might have banned private ownership of gold, but they didn't make gold go away. That Bitcoin is a greater utility than both gold and booze, and functionally based on how the network is actually constructed, harder to stop. And so it's the follow the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Well, Bitcoin has a fixed supply. The most efficient way to get it is to accept it as a form of payment. It's technically capable of being transacted over a communication channel, and those facts are what will dictate that the end game is Bitcoin being used day to day as a form of commerce. But necessarily someone has to figure out why Bitcoin will store value before they're willing to accept it as a form of payment. It's a very logical, first A then B, rather than a chicken and egg equation, and it just comes down to each individual. And as more individuals figure out why Bitcoin stores value, then more people become interested in turning around and accepting it as payment. And that's what we've seen recently. We're working on Bitcoin payments at Zaprite, and we do it in a way where people can accept Bitcoin side by side with fiat. So we integrate fiat rails. It comes with this also recognition that most people that want to, not all, but most people that want to accept Bitcoin. Some people say I'll only accept Bitcoin. That's fewer and far further between. But more power to those people, like Soap Miner. They use our platform and they only accept Bitcoin as payment. But the vast majority of people take fiat, but they prefer Bitcoin, and we'll see a shift over time. But there's a lot of people working on Bitcoin payments. BTC Pay Server integrates seamlessly with Zaprite. The guys at OpenNode, Square, which I think is a huge watershed moment. Square just launched Bitcoin payments. Now anybody that uses Square with a few clicks of a button can enable it, and a number of merchants here in Austin, Texas have already started to do that. Now I can buy my eggs and beef directly for Bitcoin. I can go to the coffee shop and use Bitcoin to pay. All of it is a logical progression of people figuring out why Bitcoin has fundamental value, why it stores value. The more people that you add up, the faster the shift to Bitcoin happens. And, again, just in that end state, it's the combination of it's technically feasible and it's perfectly consistent with the economic incentive that if you know why the 21 million fixed supply is relevant, Bitcoin for Bitcoin, sat for sat, you'll get more of it than if you go through the fiat system and incur the cost of the fiat system just to get Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree. And so, one of my thoughts though is I used to think if the government couldn't keep drugs out of prisons, how could they ban something? But now I probably think they wanted the drugs in the prison. So
I think the better explanation is if they couldn't prevent you from getting booze outside of prison, then they're not going to prevent you from, running Bitcoin nodes. And also it's like there's the other side of that dilemma, which is, as soon as you say, you can't do this, it's going to send a loud signal that there's something of real substance to Bitcoin, in that it's more likely that Bitcoin is able to credibly enforce its fixed supply because of bottom up how the system is constructed than it is that a government by decree could prevent people from using money. And that I don't think of that as hope as a strategy. It is recognizing the economic incentives and realizing that money is a very basic necessity that, functionally speaking, you would not have clean water show up to your house or electricity show up to your house on demand or get food at the grocery store if not for the function of money. And so human beings will find the things out of necessity or survival instincts, and then governments will adapt around it. They'll recognize, hey, governments need money too to coordinate their own operations, to coordinate their administrations, to fund militaries, and things aren't valuable because they're taxed. The government taxes things that are valuable. And the more logical way that this plays out is that the regulatory structure adapts around Bitcoin. The jurisdictions that are most friendly to Bitcoin, like El Salvador, will benefit from human capital immigrating to the places that respect and value sound money, and that those civilizations will flourish. It doesn't prevent other people from being more restrictive, but I think America itself is evidence of people leaving everything behind to seek out a better life where personal freedoms and individual freedoms are more respected.
So on the final note, I think this is the most important topic in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is payments. I think it's the least talked about, and I think more talked about probably is store value, maybe even unit of account. But maybe sans an outright government ban. I sort of think that the concerted effort to prevent Bitcoin as payments, or delay, because maybe it can't prevent, right? Just delay and sort of push to the side are things like, capital gains transactions, so not treating it like money. So you have to kind of think a little bit more like, did I buy this Bitcoin today? Are there gains or not gains? Are they going to ask me questions about this? Is it going to be a record? And then the ETFs is sort of, and again, none of this has to be nefarious. Just it could be sort of how centralization just begets centralization, right? But ETFs are sort of like, don't custody your Bitcoin, leave it with us. Maybe the ETFs get different tax treatment down the road. So I see sort of like, leaving Bitcoin more as a walled garden, sort of a digital pet rock. That would be sort of the effort to delay it as payments. And I think one of the other people who seem to be talking about it, like you are, is Jeff Booth. And he said several times, if Bitcoin doesn't become used as money, it will fail. Do you see, what do you see, or what is your note?
Yeah, I agree with that in the end. Like, Bitcoin does not need to be used by everyone day to day today to succeed. But if that is not where it ends, it will, because it was too centralized to evolve to that state. And if it is too centralized, then everything about the system that holds it together begins to break. And then the other side of it is, I think that there's and I wrote about this recently, not in Graduate and Suddenly, but on my blog, that the vast majority of everyone is going to be able to understand Bitcoin as they're seeing it used as money. That maybe, to this point, 99% of people that have adopted Bitcoin have adopted it because logically it stores value, and that's the logical first place to start. You convert a little bit of fiat to Bitcoin, you convert more fiat to Bitcoin, but as that understanding of the system and how it works, why it works, that it's defensible, hardens as you experience it. If you run a business, it becomes very logical to say, well, yeah, why don't, if I'm just going to take the fiat and then convert to Bitcoin, why not just, if I have people willing to pay me in Bitcoin, it becomes logical. But if it's true that 99% of people who've come to understand Bitcoin have done so because they've had this vision of, they've seen the inputs, the writing on the wall, why it's going to go from this nascent volatile store of value to a full-fledged currency that is the pricing mechanism. Everything's priced in Bitcoin and traded in Bitcoin. It's also true in my mind that the vast majority of all individuals, maybe 99% of all humans, will adopt Bitcoin as they see it working as money. And that doesn't mean that it has to be perfectly stable and it's not volatile, but seeing that, oh, actually, you can actually use Bitcoin to go buy things like eggs. Because absent that, but like the mental loop is not closed. It's like if this idea of like, oh, everyone's buying Bitcoin and no one's using, like saving in Bitcoin is using it, to be clear. I don't want to confuse things like that. But like, if they look at the world and it's like everyone has Bitcoin, but they only, convert in and out of fiat, there's this like question of like staring into the abyss of like, to what end? Of like, hey, is everyone just staring at their digital wealth? What is the value of Bitcoin? But when they see the closing of that loop, which is, oh, somebody had Bitcoin and then they use that Bitcoin. Again, when I go and buy eggs with Bitcoin, I'm not spending but a very, very, very small fraction of my Bitcoin. So the consequence of that is that I'm saving 99.999% of my Bitcoin with every purchase, unless I happen to buy a home with Bitcoin. Maybe I'll spend more, but based on the relative scale. But the point being that for a lot of people in the world that struggle to see Bitcoin, it's going to connect for them when that loop is closed. When they might not be doing it themselves, but they might see somebody else and be like, okay, people were talking about this fixed supply and its relevance, and now I'm seeing businesses accept it as payment. That's what I needed to figure out what the utility of this thing was. That it starts with its fixed supply, but then as everyone adopts it, it's actually transacting, and it's not just like the idea of me sending money to you. It's that what it is doing is it's coordinating trade. That is how money actually is a utility in creating value. That people use money to build things like cars and ships and airplanes and get gas from in the ground to above the ground to refine. All of that requires a working money, and if you don't have a working money, then those things don't exist. That economies don't scale without a working form of money. And so I think that Bitcoin being used as money, not only is it the logical end game, it is what will allow people that otherwise aren't able to see it to then adopt it as money. But it's also with that recognition that if I'm spending my Bitcoin, somebody else is saving it. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. 100% of all Bitcoin is being saved by somebody at some point in time. And the more that it is facilitating trade and direct commerce, the more value it's creating. But at that same time, when I'm spending my Bitcoin, I'm saving all of my other Bitcoin that I'm not spending. So it's both at the same time.
Sure. All right. Well, then before we roll out, tell me a little bit more about Zaprite and where we could find Zaprite, and maybe how can I use it? Can I put my BitcoinMatrix store in there and sell my T-shirts and my mugs?
Well, you should be using it if you have sponsors. So Zaprite is a payment platform that facilitates Bitcoin payments and fiat payments. We don't process fiat payments. We allow people to connect fiat rails like Square on the fiat side, Stripe on the fiat side, PayPal on the fiat side, but then Rails on the Bitcoin side, like Lightning facilitated by Strike or OpenNote, or you can connect a cold card or another hardware wallet. We support non-custodial payments, custodial payments. We meet people where they are. But the idea is that, and we typically focus on things where at least today, goods are purchased online. That could be a WooCommerce or e-commerce store. But we have invoices. So if you invoice customers as a way to bill, and that's why I was mentioning, if you invoice sponsors, that you can send an invoice and it can have Bitcoin methods of payment side by side fiat methods of payment. So you could, have automated ACH alongside a button to pay in Bitcoin, and that way you don't have to have a discussion with your customers as to whether they want to pay in Bitcoin or not. You just give them both options, and you give them both options in a way that puts Bitcoin on a level playing field as fiat, puts all of that in one system, makes your life easier, and every customer that comes through a checkout, or every customer that is paying you, whether they're paying you via an invoice or a payment link or a e-commerce store, they see that they have that option. And then also we just released in the last few months a tickets feature. So people that are hosting Bitcoin conferences or retreats or summits, that now they can have a full end-to-end ticket experience. And so if you're going to a Bitcoin event, you might, experience and go through the Zaprite checkout flow and pay in Bitcoin or pay in fiat, but then say, oh, hey, that was really seamless. Maybe I should do that too. And so they can find us at zaprite.com. It's Zaprite.com. Again, we typically don't focus on point of sale. Like if you're in the US, go sign up for Square. If you don't use Square, maybe consider changing to Square. Our view on point of sale is that the large point of sale providers will need to have an interest in Bitcoin like Square does in order to adopt it. And maybe Zaprite, we would love to integrate into a POS system, but recreating the POS system is a challenge. And so for that reason, we really focus on the kind of the epicenter of where the most likely commerce transactions between businesses that want to accept Bitcoin and Bitcoiners that have Bitcoin that are willing to spend it. And so we also have an API. So if you have a custom application, you can integrate our API and be able to manage one single API and facilitate all of your Bitcoin and fiat payments in a seamless way. So if you bill people via invoices, if you have a basic web store, if you're hosting an event, check us out at Zaprite. Custom application, our API is phenomenal, but we're just building out to where we think the highest leverage is in terms of where the most logical early adoption of Bitcoin payments is.
That's awesome. I'm gonna have to sign up.
Yeah,
I think it sounds fantastic.
And it comes with a 30-day free trial, so you can test it out. Plug it in, get all your payment methods set up, and honestly, Zaprite can be set up in 10 minutes. It's super easy, and yeah, it's a phenomenal product.
Well, it sounds like 10 minutes well spent. After you solve payments over at Zaprite, are you going to finally run for mayor of Austin?
Yeah, probably. Depending. My first goal would be to get somebody else to do it that I trust, but if the world has solved sound money, then I could go think about other problems. But if we don't fix the money, then there's not a lot of use in trying to fix city politics. So I'll either do that or I have dreams of creating a butcher shop one day. So love beef. So I don't just track the cost of my ribeyes for kicks on the internet. I really value my local ranchers and want to be part of a solution there.
Wow, maybe we could find a couple of investors, because we could do Satoshi Steak and Ale House, and we could have an in-shop butcher. A little meat market in the front of the steakhouse.
Yeah,
I think it would be great. This has been such a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this a long time. This has definitely been awesome. So dope. Please let everyone know where they can find you and your personal work.
Yeah. So if you're a business owner that is interested in accepting Bitcoin as payment, definitely check us out at zaprite.com, Zaprite. If you submit a contact or the contact form because you're interested, I'll likely be the person that gets back to you. I handle most of our inbound. I'll help you directly. And then if you're not yet there on your journey of, Bitcoin's not quite making sense, but starting to come in focus, you can find my book on Safety and Moose's website, the author of the Bitcoin Standard. It's there exclusively. That website is thesafehouse.com. So safe is spelled SAIF, thesafehouse.com. My book is Gradually Then Suddenly, but there's a number of other great Bitcoin books there. Buy one, buy them all. You can also... So the book's called Gradually and Suddenly. I also have a blog that I put out content, once a month or every other month, gradually then suddenly.xyz. And I'm on Twitter or X at Parker A. Lewis. I think that pretty much covers most of the bases.
Nice. Yeah, the books coming out of the Safe House are of the highest quality. I can attest to that. And if you guys are going to shoot Parker a note via Zaprite, please put in the BitcoinMatrix and maybe the notes just so he kind of sees maybe some of the flow from there. But I appreciate this so much, Parker. This has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Cedric. Again, sorry that that took this long to get on, but I'm excited to finally do it and really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Bitcoin Matrix. If you enjoyed the conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below with any questions or thoughts you may have. We'd love to hear from you. You can support the show by checking out our sponsors and affiliate links in the description. It helps keep bringing you great content while connecting you with awesome products that I believe in. Share this episodes with your friends, family, or anyone curious about Bitcoin. And let's keep growing this community together. Stay curious, keep stacking, and I'll catch you in the next one.